we did our first big survey in 2018. And I would say, I don't know how much the vibe shift was reflecting in that data. Like that data set looked very much a continuation of what we'd seen before, that we had this very large kind of cold segment in our population towards the Bible and Christianity. But we were starting to see this, I'm searching for meaning. And among certain groups, like, yeah, maybe Christianity and the Bible could have something to say, but it was certainly in that data set not where we are today, and things have changed really quickly. And one thing that I had forgotten, and I found it in our old notes a little bit ago, was when we did focus groups out of that 2018 stuff. So this would have been 2019, when we surveyed one of our atheist groups. I've got a quote which says, this is completely irrelevant to me. I don't know. Maybe it would take something like a global pandemic, and then I might be interested in God again. And honestly, the hairs on my arms went up when I read that. And I wonder, on your reflections, I think you've been really helpful in pointing out that this has been brewing for some time. To what extent, in your view, was the pandemic a catalyst or an accelerant perhaps, or kind of a bit of a rogue element in the whole thing? What do you think?
I do think it's significant, and partly just because it provided a sort of enforced fire break. Just for at least a month or two at the very beginning, everyone had to confront their own mortality. I think that was not insignificant in what that did. I think initially, most church leaders I knew were like, oh my goodness, this is a disaster, we can't meet. But at the same time, yeah, I felt like that period was actually quite fruitful in terms of, even though a lot of it was being mediated online, there was just a lot more openness generally, I found, to faith. And I think that has continued, and especially the generation that were kind of the most affected by the pandemic are the Gen Z generation. My kids, their schooling and their relationships and all the stuff that happens as you're sort of developing at such a critical moment in your life, it all gets quite badly affected, obviously, by this sudden break. The fact it's kind of coming on top of all of the pressures of social media and the alienation and the dislocation and everything else that I think that brings to young people today. I think it just sort of accelerated that. And I've just met a lot of young people who are now interested in faith and coming to church, who basically that pandemic was kind of the catalyst, if you like, for the journey they've been on since. I mean, one example is a young woman in our congregation, and she says exactly this. She didn't grow up in a Christian family. She sort of had a Christian grandmother. That was her only real connection with church. But she had moved from South Africa to the UK, and it was during the pandemic. She would have been about 15 years old. She just got very depressed and felt so isolated. And she began a kind of a spiritual search at that point online, obviously, ran into on TikTok, lots of the crystals and manifesting and horoscopes and all the rest of it. None of it seemed to quite gel. Started to see one or two Christian influencers pop up. Naturally, as soon as you start watching them, more of them come in your timeline algorithmically. But what they had, there was something about what they had that felt different to her. So she asked her grandmother if she could buy her a copy of the Bible. She did. She read the Bible. She said she was like, she'd never read it before, but she was just felt it was like speaking to her, like all the time. And so, fast forward to basically the end of last year, she thought, well, I need to find a church. She'd basically become a Christian, kind of completely independently of ever walking into a church or really meeting a Christian apart from her grandmother. And so she ended up in our church, and she was baptized just this last Pentecost. And that's not that unusual a story. And sort of the way in which social media is both a curse and a blessing, it's part of the problem, if you like, but it's also allowed her to encounter Christianity without ever having to actually physically meet a Christian.
Yeah, and as you say, I think this is a not uncommon story. It's certainly over the last few months, speaking to church leaders, I've heard a few themes come out. So one is around almost like unprompted spiritual encounter. So I've heard a lot about dreams, which is just so interesting how often independently this is coming up again, or people feeling like, oh, I've just got to go to church, and they don't even know why, right? Like when they're being asked, they don't have the language to express other than, I like being here. But another stream that sometimes sits separately or sometimes relatedly is this almost like digital discipleship. So people hearing influencers or hearing podcasts or something, and then, oh, I'm liking this. And as you say, they then pick up more content. And it's almost that they'll hear that Christians go to church, so then they try and find a church. And I wonder, compared to perhaps the previous era we were in around apologetics and stuff, when this is the way people are finding faith, like what does that mean for your average church leader? What's this new landscape that they need to be understanding?
I think that's a great question, and it is one I sort of tackled sort of in the earlier phase, if you like, of, you know, when I was writing the book. I did feel like the questions that were often being tackled were not necessarily the same as 20 years ago in the zenith of the new atheism, and that was, you know, that was my bread and butter, you know, classic apologetics. And there's obviously a place for that, you know. I think there will always be a place for that more sort of traditional apologetics. There are always going to be people with those kinds of questions and intellectual objections. But I was also aware that the new kind of conversations around God were much more about the values that we have in our culture. What do we lose sort of just culturally and psychologically and emotionally when we lose the story of Christianity? People aren't waking up in the morning saying, you know, give me 5 philosophical proofs for God. They're sort of waking up and saying, give me a reason to get out of bed because I'm feeling depressed and anxious and dislocated. And so that, I think, is the kinds of issues and question that the average church leader needs to be probably prioritizing. Okay, people will still have those intellectual questions, but I suspect they're going to come later rather than those being the primary things. And one of the ways I've kind of, I think that it might be helpful for church leaders and Christians generally to think about how to present Christianity in this new environment is to take a leaf out of Blaise Pascal's book, actually, who, you know, back when he was offering similar advice, said, make good people wish that Christianity were true and then show them that it is. It's that sort of, it's appealing to the heart and to this sense of how you would like life to be and why life isn't measuring up to the way you want it to be. And I think Christianity answers that emotional need, and that's probably the place to start with most people. Then, of course, people may have questions about, well, can I actually trust this book and this person and so on? And then there's always going to be a place for that more traditional apologetics to show them that it is true. But help them to realize why they want it to be true in the first place. And I think there's an openness right now to people wishing it were true. You know, the average agnostic or atheist I meet today doesn't tend to be the kind who says, it's all baloney, the sooner we get rid of it, the better. They're more often saying, I wish I could believe this, because wouldn't it be great if this were true? And that's the kind of shift, I think, that we're sort of seeing in that sort of secular arena.